But then you get somebody like Christina Hoff Sommers, who made a video, and she was talking in her video. Her video was pretty much a case of, well, if I can tell you what the factors are, then that explains it, and that's the end of it. And it just doesn't always work like that. And the problem is that someone like Christina Hoff Sommers is intelligent and well read enough on this to know. So she is misrepresenting, I'm quite certain on that, because she talked about, gave a number of the factors, and some of them I agreed with her about, and I thought, yeah, that is enough. Actually, with that factor, that is an explanation. But she talked about the fact that, well, the jobs that women tend to go into, and maybe I'll pause the video and show the clip when I get to editing. The jobs that women tend to go into tend to be the less well-paid jobs. And so that's it. That's explained it, really. It's not that men are getting paid better than women. It's that women are going into less well-paid jobs. So there you go. Take that. She says something like, if you take that into account, that women tend to go into less well-paid professions, the wage gap mysteriously disappears. As if that's the end of the conversation. It isn't. That's the kind of... And she's aware of this. She has to be aware of this. That isn't the end of the conversation. That's the start of the conversation. To hold the view that we have these predispositions, but say, well, don't worry if this profession pays less than this one, right? Women can just go to where the money is, because you know it's not as fucking simple as that. And then we have the people, the social justice mob on the other side, and what they say is no more reasonable, because they are the ones for whom this shouldn't be a problem, right? They're the ones who just see us all as a blank, more of a blank slate, right? It's just culture here. So it really shouldn't take very long, should it, to get women motivated to go just where the money goes, right? And yet they're the ones that have the object. They're the ones that say, oh, no, this is just, you can't expect that. That's not going to happen, right? So I see some dissonance on both sides here. It's almost as if one of them ought to say, hang on a minute, mate, I think you've got half my argument there. Can I have it back? Because the two arguments don't mate up. They need to be going like that, and they're going like this. That's the problem with it. If you believe that we have these predispositions, then unwarranted differentials in pay that result from historical things are a problem. And if you don't believe that we have these predispositions, then these historical problems aren't, at least they're not a gender issue, because people are fluid and they can much more easily change the types of profession that they are interested in. So I think that is an issue, right, in terms of the wage gap.
So first off, we're going to look at the notion that it's not as fucking simple as telling women to just go into more lucrative fields. I sort of butchered that accent, didn't I? Terrible. But I do want to say, of course, it's not that simple. I would not go into engineering for all the farms in Cuba, as Bob Dylan once famously said. Not for love or money. And this is even less so after being partners with an engineer for 5 years, and he informs me in the most excruciating, mind-numbing, self-harm inducing detail about what he does for work. He starts talking about Visual Basic or JavaScript or object-oriented programming, and eventually I'm like putting a serrated knife to my own throat and promising that I'll do it before he'll finally stop. I do agree both sides tend to take a simplistic view of these things. Oh, if you want to earn more money, just go into engineering. No, it's not that simple. Yes, there's the possibility that fields dominated by women paying less on average may be in part a hangover from earlier times when men bore the primary or sole financial responsibility for their families, and women were commensurately actually paid less for essentially the exact same work. But it might not be a hangover in the way Jim suggested, right? That's maybe, it's not that we devalue work that's done by women just because it's done by women. If you really think about the value of women's work and you put it into a historical context, well, think about it. The unpaid labor of housewives that feminists of the 60s and 70s railed about wasn't unpaid at all. I mean, it didn't come with a pay stub and a tax bill, but every husband was essentially required and expected to share his own pay equitably with his wife. He literally owed her a living in exchange for the roles she fulfilled in his household. So from his own pocket, with his own blood and sweat, he was expected to pay for the work that she did to make his life better, right? So I really find it difficult to, these suggestions that women's work was not valued back then, when the guy comes home from the coal mine and hands half of his pay over to his wife. So every once in a while, the question comes up as to how much men should pay their wives for their housewifery. And this isn't really a new phenomenon. I mean, suffragettes were busy in 1910 arguing that the marital contract was unfair to women because husbands weren't forced to cut their wives a paycheck on top of paying all of their wives' bills. These days it usually gets framed in terms of, if a man had to pay a woman to do everything his stay-at-home wife does, he'd have to spend $60,000 a year. Now, I myself have always wanted someone to run the real numbers for these housewives. I mean, sure, he pays her what one might pay a live-in nanny or housekeeper, plus overtime and on-call duty, $60,000. And then he deducts her half of the mortgage, property taxes, income taxes, utilities, furniture, appliances, renovations, upgrades, and maintenance. He deducts then the full amount of her food, clothing, toiletries, entertainment, cosmetics, and transportation. If she has her own vehicle, well, that's on her. The payments, the insurance, the gas, and the maintenance. Then he deducts her half of the children's expenses, hockey equipment, tutors, babysitting, food, clothes, school fees, dance lessons, and all of that. Then he charges her half the going rate for cleaning the gutters, mowing the lawn, staining the deck, and all the other stuff men typically do in order to help their households run. Because, she co-owns the house, right? Therefore, she's responsible for half of its upkeep. Now, would the average woman walk away with a profit, or would she end up owing him money? It's kind of hard to figure out, and I really wish somebody would crunch those numbers. Somebody with better math skills than me, maybe. Now, regardless of any of that, how on earth can any feminist say a man doesn't value what his stay-at-home wife does if he's literally forking over a significant portion of his own hard-earned money to enable her to do that work? How could they claim patriarchy didn't value this work done by women when patriarchy required men to pay for it through their own labor, to walk home, again, from their 12 hours at the coal mine and hand over some or all of their packet of pay to their wives? But I'm getting off into the weeds here. What we are discussing is the possibility that the predispositions of men and women might influence what fields they're drawn to, and the idea that fields dominated by women are lower paid than those dominated by men because of some kind of hangover from the days when women did receive less pay for the same work, when women's work was valued less than men's. Now, it's important to note that Jim isn't actually making any claims here. He's asserting that it's plausible that female-dominated work is not compensated as generously as male-dominated work because of this lingering idea that women's work is worth less than men's work. To me, I would suggest that that's kind of a chicken and egg argument. According to Catherine Hakim, I believe she's with the London School of Economics, when fields previously dominated by men are overrun with women, they lose status and the relative pay decreases. Now, the hangover might not be from some sense that women's work is worth less than men's work. The hangover might be from the fact that women understand they can rely on other sources of income, husbands, subsidies, etc., and therefore do not prioritize earnings and are therefore willing to work for less. Now, the graphic that Jim showed, and I'll put up a screenshot of it here, on part-time work, kind of demonstrates that. Obviously, men feel more pressure to work full-time than women do. Is it perhaps because men are pressured internally or externally to prioritize earnings while women are not? I'm reminded of a woman named Abby I used to work with. and I feel okay using her real name because this is like 25 years ago or more. She had a teaching degree in primary school education, but she was working as a barmaid in the same high-end restaurant that I was. And I asked her why she wasn't teaching, and she kind of got this really dismissive look on her face and said, oh, I could get a teaching job if I'm willing to move to Kitimat or like 100 Mile House, but I shouldn't have to move into the middle of nowhere just to get a job. Now, I've also noticed another thing in my travels driving through the hinterlands of Alberta. You know, huge billboards in small farming communities advertising that they desperately need a veterinarian. Veterinary medicine has been dominated by women for a long time now, like decades. And there's a glut of vets in the city catering to people with cute little doggies and cute little cats. For people who need veterinary care for large animals and livestock, there's a massive shortage, and women vets, they just don't seem to be all that interested in moving to Nanton, Alberta, to shove their arms up cow vaginas or vaccinate pigs. Now, would this difference, whether it's cultural or biological that leads more women than men to choose part-time work, not also have an effect on the impulse to demand the highest compensation one could possibly get for one's work, or to endure unpleasant, difficult, or inconvenient conditions in order to get that higher compensation? If a male veterinarian is willing to move to Nanton, Alberta and shove his arm up cow vaginas while 80% of his colleagues are not, whether it's because cow vaginas are gross or whether it's because there's no decent nightclubs or shopping in Nanton, shouldn't he earn more money? Part of supply and demand includes the demands of employees for what they see as reasonable compensation. And if that's the case, would it not follow that once a field becomes dominated by a group of people who don't feel as much pressure to prioritize earnings, regardless of where that pressure comes from, wouldn't pay in that field tend to go down? Wouldn't it stand to reason that when a field becomes dominated by people who are willing to work as a bartender rather than a teacher, because being a teacher isn't worth the bother of moving, that the relative status of that career might undergo a decline? Now, Jim mentioned men's reactions to mechanization. You know, when employers could replace skilled male workers with less costly female employees working at machines during the Industrial Revolution. Well, there were two things, not just one, that were going on there. Employers could save money in wages and increase productivity, and they would jump at any chance to do so. But in order for women to replace those male workers, women had to be willing or able to work for less pay than men did. Now, why would women be willing to do so? Perhaps this is one of those predispositions, or maybe a lack of a predisposition. You know, because when women entered the workforce, they had their husbands' paychecks covering the lion's share of the family expenses. I doubt any of them realized that by taking those jobs en masse, each of them were displacing some other woman's husband, and the woman next to her might be displacing her own. And both of them were actually endangering the very thing, his bigger paycheck, that allowed them to offer their own labor for less pay. I mean, remember, men railed against this situation while women cheered it on. Men lamented being displaced from well-paying jobs while women didn't lament. Maybe they lacked the foresight. Maybe they just couldn't envision what might happen. But they instead rushed in to work for less money. My husband still has a job. All I need is pin money. Until he doesn't have a job because the woman down the street offered to work for less than him because her husband has a job and all she needs is pin money. Until he doesn't have a job anymore because the woman 3 blocks over offered to work for less because her husband has a job and all she needs is pin money. So let's fast forward to today and an article, and I wish I had the link handy. I'm going to try and find it and stick it in the low bar, about how women in the UK are increasingly the primary or sole breadwinners of their families, and they do not like it. They feel intense pressure and strain from the very idea that there are other people relying on them to keep bringing in a good, steady paycheck. I thought that was called male patriarchal privilege back when that was men's role. And dovetailing with this new problem women have, we have the new American dream of women. Polls have fairly consistently indicated that working women, overwhelmingly, would rather work less than more, and a large minority would prefer not to have to work at all. Now, Jim indicated that his wife chose to work part-time, and he chose to work full-time after they had a baby just a year and a half ago. Now, this is typical of the choices most couples make, but Jim's wife couldn't choose to work part-time if it wasn't for Jim being willing and able to work full-time, could she? She couldn't alternatively choose to work in a lower-paying field, if not for Jim being there working full-time for good money. In short, she could not afford to deprioritize earnings in these ways if she were the sole or primary breadwinner rather than the person who fills in the financial gaps or the person whose primary motivation is to just get out of the house for a while. In fact, I doubt most women could make these choices at all to deprioritize their earnings, work part-time, choose fulfillment over money, and maintain the lifestyles they seem to desire if Jim's country, the UK, and mine, and the US didn't offer things like maternity leave and daycare subsidies and publicly funded education at the primary level and all kinds of other stuff. They simply wouldn't be able to do it.